But welcome, everybody. As I said, I'm Joanna Kerr with MakeWay, and I'm really thrilled to be co-hosting this event, co-hosting it with OneEarth. And we are also partnering with the Environmental Funders of Canada and Hot and Cool Institute and Sacred Earth Solar. I'm joining you today from a beautiful Ojibwe and Huron-Wendat territory. It's about a couple of hours north of Toronto. And I really don't consider this acknowledgement lightly. I never do. As we're going to discuss today, we know that the resistance, the resilience, the wisdom of Indigenous peoples over the centuries is what we're going to need to center much more intentionally if we are truly to get to a place of sustainable living every day. I think today's conversation is one that many of you have been having, but one we're going to have for many days and years to come. How do we change the way we live, every single one of us on this planet, to save ourselves from climate catastrophe and to ensure that all life on Earth has an actual chance for survival? I'm sure, like me, you walk into a supermarket and you see rows and rows and rows of processed food, cans, beautiful produce. Most of it, you know, is going to end up in the bin. Or you sit in a traffic jam and you're just surrounded by cars, individuals in cars going who knows where, all driven on fossil fuel. Or you look out in your condo and you see crane after new high-rise being built not in ways that are good for the planet or for bird migration. It's this great hypocrisy that we're all living. It's this, cognitive dissonance. What can I do? How is our society going to shift? How are our belief systems going to shift? Our structures, our cultures? And why does it all have to be so polarizing, so political? And these values that are shoved down our throats, every message that we see is that more is better, or all of these things are going to make you more successful, more secure. We measure our economy by gross national product, not by gross national happiness. And nature, well, that's something over there, something that you get to enjoy on the weekends with a hike or on a vacation. But there is good news. We know that there is amazing amount of momentum. And as we hear about the news of COP.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Siri didn't know what I said. There's an amazing amount of momentum. Plant-based diets. We talk about circular economy, well-being economy, care economy. We talk here in Canada about Indigenous protected and conservation areas as the nature-based climate solution. We talk about moving from loneliness to community, from clutter to simplicity, from retail therapy to forest bathing. Living joyfully and equitably within planetary boundaries is growing. Fact is, change is all around us, but it's hidden. It's marginal. It's seen as alternative. I don't know, but if you've been to other parts of the world like Costa Rica or Denmark or different towns in England or Salt Spring Island or Bella Bella or Clyde River and Nunavut, you can see things that are happening. The systems are there. Cultural values are reinforced. Behaviors are different. We can live together differently. And that's what so many of us want to accelerate and ensure we do it equitably and that we're not blaming the individual, but we are truly part of a system that is transforming. So let's leave this webinar feeling inspired and knowing what we need to do next. So with that, let me introduce my new friend, Devika Shah, who's taken over Environmental Funders of Canada. And we're thrilled that she's leading the charge there. Devika has had many, many years working on social justice and environment. She's been with the Social Planning of Toronto and the Pembina Institute. She's going to join us now and share a few words. So over to you, Devika.
Thank you, Joanna. It's really a pleasure to be here. Um, um, I want to thank MakeWay and OneEarth for their leadership in this space. It's really important. So just before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga of the Credit, otherwise known as Toronto, which is probably the biggest culprit in our country when it comes to the issues we're going to be talking about today. I recently connected with the majority of EFC members one-on-one, and I asked everybody, what do you think is the biggest barrier that the environmental movement faces? And why do you think we're not further along by now? And the number one response by far from funders that have funded a lot of policy solutions and technical solutions has been that our messages to the public has fallen on deaf ears. We haven't been able to move forward. We're preaching to the choir. We need to better understand people's psychology. And it's got me thinking a lot about COVID, which is a global emergency. But in 2 years, all sorts of government rules and regulations that fundamentally have changed our way of life in many tangible and difficult ways have been implemented. And there have also been some positive discoveries about the benefits of working from home and that sort of thing. But to successfully respond to this crisis, we needed a mix of top-down policy solutions like CERB and rules about mask mandates and all of that, paired with all sorts of public education efforts, and literally every part of society doing its part to bring about these shifts, including getting 13 provinces and territories to row in the same direction, which is still a work in progress. But it has been successful in that about 70% of the population is going along with it in less than 2 years. Now imagine if we actually admitted that we're in a way, way bigger emergency called the climate emergency. And all of a sudden the government, similar to China's one-child policy said, we're limiting everyone to one flight a year and you can only eat this much red meat and dairy per year and the carbon tax is tripling. Even if there were no industry lobby, if we don't have about 70% of the population ready and willing and on board and be coaxable, then that government is going to be booted out and there will be no change whatsoever. So, the reality is we are in a climate emergency and we do have to be on board with making those kinds of changes pretty immediately. So when I think about that and I think about the differences with the climate crisis and COVID, one, COVID had an obvious tangible emergency. People are dying right now, and there's a direct line of causation to a specific virus. Climate change, as we all know, is intertwined with the biodiversity crisis. It manifests in a million different ways, floods, heat waves, etc. And we're not saying hundreds of people died in BC from climate change in the form of a heat wave, or thousands of people have died in Syria from climate change in the form of a war fueled by water scarcity. Not to mention that many of the deaths, some are happening now, but many will be happening in the future. So in response to this big crisis, massive system change shifts are absolutely necessary, like they were with COVID, but at a much greater magnitude. And it requires significant government and institutional leadership, but those changes will impact on the way we live our lives. And negatively in some ways, there's no sugarcoating that, but also positively in lots of ways. So we need a large number of us embracing these 1.5 degree ways of living. And when we talk about that culture shift, like that's what's required is a culture shift here. When we talk about that culture shift, we often think of youth mobilization and NGOs doing outreach. That is a subset of this, but what we're really talking about is wholesale cultural shift. And, I think about how influential shows like The Ellen Show and Will and Grace and Modern Family have been in helping to legalize gay marriage. And that's what we're talking about, like literally every aspect of human society working to bring about this shift. So this is critically important, high impact work. I think it's the most overlooked in our area of work. And I really, really encourage my colleagues in philanthropy to take this work seriously. We as philanthropy are the sector that are best positioned to catalyze big shifts. It's our job to think 10 steps ahead of industry, 10 steps ahead of government, 10 steps ahead of nonprofits. And that's why at EFC, we're so happy to support this initiative. So thank you very much. And I will pass the baton over to our next presenter.
Thanks, Devika. Really appreciate it. So we are going to hear from three remarkable individuals who've been doing a lot of work in this area. And their bios were in your invitation. I'm gonna hand it off to Lewis Akenji, who's going to be speaking next. He's the managing director of Hot and Cool Institute. He's been doing work on sustainable development at the global level and sustainable consumption for many, many years. And he's been doing some very, very important research on 1.5 degree lifestyles. And he's just released the Canadian data, which is, I think, to say the least, an eye-opener for so many of us in terms of the role that Canadians per capita are playing vis-a-vis our carbon budget. So Lewis, welcome. He's joining us from Berlin, and he'll talk for 15 minutes, and then we'll hear the other two speakers, and then we'll, if you have questions or comments, save them for the time towards the end. So over to you, Lewis. Welcome.
Thank you so very much, Joanna. And it's wonderful to see friends here, but it's even better. It's wonderful to see so many faces that I do not know. What this tells us that there's growing interest in this topic, and so it should be. It's quite important before I start that when you see lots of numbers here, this report is ultimately about people. It's about our aspirations and the future that we dream of. It's about the collective ambition that we have as societies, and knowing that, we are at a very critical juncture and rapid transitioning is needed. So the role of Canada as a sort of a leading economy, but also a country that has shown conscience in the past is very important here. Why are we talking about lifestyles here? Because quite often when people think about lifestyles, it's just a matter, they talk about it in terms of opinions or feelings, and almost as if there's no science behind it. So one of the things we set out to do was to look at how lifestyles can contribute to the Paris Agreement, to the 1.5 degree aspirational target. We know that governments tend to not touch consumption, especially because they're afraid of getting voters angry, and businesses shy away from reducing production, of course, because of profits. So this is very difficult territory, but I hope to demonstrate that there is science that argues very strongly for a radical shift in the way we live and in the way we meet our needs every day in society. The recent IPCC report tells us very clearly that we have, at the current rates of emissions, another 10 years, and we're crossing into very, very dangerous territory, which is hard to predict. And it also argues that by the middle of this decade, we need to have peaked and then radically start reducing our emissions. It means we have a very fast shrinking carbon budget. Quite often what you see shown is graphs like this, which represents territorial emissions. This one is by the government of Canada. And as you can see, Canada is one of the top emitting economies, but even so, it's fairly low down the list, below China, below India, below Japan. This is what is called territorial-based accounting. What it does not show you, however, is the impact of all the meat in China, which supports lifestyles in Canada, or the meat that is imported from Brazil or New Zealand and consumed in Canada. So in order to get close to lifestyles as much as possible, we look at consumption-based accounting. And what we pretty much do is take the remaining carbon budget that is given by the IPCC, distribute it equitably across the globe, and we remove capital formation and government expenditure in order to arrive at the impact of lifestyles on the climate. It shows that we're currently at a global average of about 4.6 tons per person per year. And if we need to meet the 1.5 degree target, we need to ultimately go down to 0.7 tons per person per year. Between now and 2030, we need to go down to 2.5 tons. That's about a 50% reduction. But this is not for all countries. So I would like to show you how it differs across countries, looking at the 10 economies that we compared in the report. You can already see very clearly here that among the countries that we compared, it doesn't mean Canada is the top in the world, but amongst those that we looked at, including Canada, Finland, the UK, Japan, China, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, India, and Indonesia, Canada is fairly high by a huge distance. And remember the 2030 target, this is how much we need to squeeze in, or even the 2050 target, this is how far we need to go down. So these are not small numbers. We're looking at upwards of 80% reductions in lifestyle carbon footprints here. But also notice the differences, just the footprint from transportation from personal transportation in Canada alone is bigger than the per capita footprint of someone who lives in China or someone who lives in South Africa. And it's not only industrialized countries that need to reduce lifestyle carbon footprints here. We see already that countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, that compared to where they need to be in the year 2050, already need to start thinking about reductions. And these are countries that still have hundreds of millions of persons that are living below the poverty line. And they would need to actually increase your consumption per capita in order to offer lives of dignity to their citizens. But where is the consumption space for that? I thought it's worth going into a bit of the data to show why exactly Canada comes up far ahead of most countries. Canada, of course, is a big country. So we see that typically in the case of transportation, an average Canadian drives about or travels about 22,000 kilometers a year. That compared to a Japanese who does just about a half of that. And car driving, small trucks in Canada are some of the biggest corporates here. It's pretty much a car culture. You can see the story behind the numbers here. It's not only that, you know, it's also public transportation. You can compare, in this case, Canada to Japan, where about 33%, I think, of total transport demand in Japan is actually public transport, while in Canada, that number is about 15%. Or you can look at train use. Japan has a highly developed train system, and about 28% of public transportation is through the train. But in Canada, that number is at about 0.5%. So these are really the disparities, a combination of how much people travel and the intensity of the travel means. So private car use and flying are really quite major here. In India, for example, which shows a completely different culture, it's motorcycle use, which is quite a big deal. Or you can look at housing. Canada is a cold country, and you don't expect people to have cold winters or not heat their homes in the winter. This is where heating and cooling comes in terms of housing. But again, it is not just the heating and the cooling that is a problem here. It is also the sizes of the houses and the source of the energy. So in Canada, for example, the living space per person is about 58 or just under 60 square meters. You can compare this to the UK, where that is 39 square meters, right? And having to heat this in a very cold winter means that it needs a lot more energy than other countries. It is that, but it is also because most of the energy is from non-renewable sources. That's natural gas, which is being used in Canada, or pumped hydro. Although hydroelectricity is a renewable energy source, pumped hydro is an especially unsustainable one compared to hydroelectricity. And all of this is happening in a context where, you know, the winters are very cold, and but you cannot deny people sort of basic comfort or basic heating. So a combination of the intensity of the energy that is used for heating and cooling and how much space is heated or cooled is putting Canada quite far ahead here. The implications here are really very clear. There are limits to consumption, especially biophysical limits, which we cannot transgress. So we need to start letting go of certain things, and the sooner we do that, the better. It's not only letting go, we need to find new ways. In doing so, we also need to avoid this small action trap where we think just fringe changes here and there are going to get us there. You've seen the numbers, you've seen the magnitude of change that is required, these fringe elements are not going to bring about this rapid transition that we need. We need to prioritize actions that really generate momentum in society and experiments that have a very high return potential. Business as usual is really not an option here. And in going about this, we also need to start taking out the bad options, the harmful consumption options that are available in society and make the default much more sustainable. A couple of things will be needed, and I point out just one or two that are in the report. The first one is that we generally talk about reductions so much that it starts scaring people. We also need visions that can guide us into a more positive future. But in developing these multifaceted visions for different societies, we should avoid what we typically see, these technology utopias and economy-centric economic growth mantras that really do not add up to much. The second thing is, with the type of numbers that we're showing here and the radical reductions that are needed, we need unprecedented capacity building, not just for individuals, but also for businesses, for governments, for institutions. And part of this needs us to imagine a future that is very different, that is radically different from what we know today, right? The report talks a lot about a fair consumption space because not everyone contributes the same amount to the problem that we're now facing. We know from global analysis by Oxfam, for example, that the richest 10% of society contributes more than 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest 50% contribute just about 10%. This is a sort of perversion in which we find ourselves. There's a very strong correlation between income or riches and greenhouse gas emissions. In the case of Canada, this is data from Statistics Canada. You see the wealth inequality here. So you can already start telling the sort of disparities in wealth and who is contributing more to the problem of Canada here. We see these vast inequalities across the globe. So we have inequalities between countries, we have inequalities within countries, we have inequalities amongst races, gender, we have all forms of inequality that are exacerbating attention here. We see climate change beginning to drive lots of problems in ways that had not been thought about before. So how do we do this? We've talked about a climate emergency. So if you have a climate emergency coupled with vast inequalities, how do we allocate a limited and fast shrinking carbon budget that we have in a manner that is fair to everyone, but also very radically decreasing our footprints within the limited time frame, the 10 years that the IPCC gives us, within which must change course. We talk about a fair consumption space. There are a couple of things here. In the report, we analyze food, housing, transport, consumer goods, services, and leisure as the hotspots from which we get the emissions. The needs here must be met within this fair consumption space. It also becomes very clear that there are upper limits beyond which we should not go. We call this the environmental ceiling, and lower limits below which we cannot let people fall. Poverty is also a form of unsustainable consumption, and we need to increase the consumption of people that live below this floor. And the space that we have in between for showing our differences, our variations in culture and status and lifestyles is what we're calling a fair consumption space. That is the negotiation ground that we have. We should be careful, however, as we pursue this in making sure that we do not ask individuals or consumers to take responsibilities that are beyond what they have the capacity for. In the report, part of what we try to do is to show scenarios for 2030 that allow countries to meet their 2030 targets. That's to be at 2.5 tons per person in 2030. And we make a distinction between consumption-focused scenarios and system-focused scenarios. In almost all actually in all the countries, and especially in the case of Canada, you cannot get to this target by only changing behavior or by only shifting, changing the system. We need both system change and individual behavior change. This systems or just asking an either or is just putting here a false dichotomy. We need to get rid of that. And the sooner we do it, the better. But also to start understanding very carefully that people do not get up every day wanting to harm the environment, right? They're just trying to meet their neighbors, to live with each other, to express love and affection, to meet their basic needs. And these basic needs are really at the core of why we consume and what should be allocated for this fair consumption space. As this diagram shows, as you get increasingly outward, you have much less control over that. So your gender, your age, the sort of friendships that you have, your physical abilities, and your income start having a stronger impact on your choices. But it gets even tougher once you start looking at the macro context. So the economy, the messages from the media, the politics and policies, the available infrastructure that locks people into particular behavior modes, or the culture. So you see that people do not always have the means to control the socio-technical context that predetermines certain choices for them. It is quite important then to make a distinction between what an individual can do and what at a systems level needs to change, right? But the problem is that almost all of these are subordinated to an economy that is putting us on fire. The media is subordinated to the economy. The politics or infrastructure decisions are made in a very perverse sense, not necessarily in terms of what drives our happiness, but what brings economic growth. And we need to start replacing this to reposition our economies, our social norms, infrastructure, investments, institutions within a planetary boundary context and with a fair consumption space in order to ensure a fair consumption space for all. There are three very key determinants here that we should take into consideration as we think about the larger scale transformation. The first one is the attitude. This is where education comes in, awareness raising comes in, culture change, and so on. But there's also just having the right attitude or pro-sustainability attitude is not enough. We need something to translate that attitude into action. And this is where facilitators come in. We're talking about laws, policies. We're also talking about the economy, administrative processes, and so on. And last but not the least, we actually need the hardware or the infrastructure that allows people to behave in particular ways. If you're investing more in building highways instead of your public transportation system, what you're defaulting people to do is to get private cars. If you're investing more in building airports, what you're defaulting is getting people to fly around. All this must be considered as governments think about investments, but also as institutions and funders as well begin to drive for a transition towards a future society. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I hope we can have a good conversation and some really good action going forward.
Thanks so much, Lewis. And yeah, please have a look at the report because it's challenging, but it's very promising in terms of the amount of solutions that are being offered and the amount of work that's going on around the world that I think Canada can also really learn from. So we are going to open up for conversation and questions in a second. But now I get to welcome someone who's dear to me, whom I've known for many years, who is a phenomenal global leader, Melina Laboucan-Massimo, who is the co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action and Sacred Earth Solar. And Melina has had the opportunity to talk to Vanessa and I earlier and wanted to really underpin what Indigenous voices have been saying for a very long time around sustainable living. And we really wanted to ensure that any work going forward is actually completely uplifting, amplifying, leading communities and their perspectives. And Melina is going to share with us some really, I think, poignant and profound perspectives on this. So Melina, welcome.
Tansegwakia, Neo Melina Laboucan-Massimo, Nia Nihiao Kineskumtanawao. That is my language for introducing myself. I am Nihiao Laboucan Cree from Northern Alberta, Treaty 8 territory, where I was born in my reserve called Little Buffalo. And I'm going to pull up a quick PowerPoint. First of all, thank you so much, Joanna and Vanessa and Devika for hosting me. And it was so great to hear from Lewis just now and the amazing research that he is doing. So it's just really nice to be in this conversation. I also want to acknowledge that I'm on unceded Lekwungen territory in so-called Victoria, where I'm calling in from today. And just gonna put my PowerPoint on now. I'm just gonna share my screen. So, equitable 1.5 degree lifestyles. So I'm coming at this from an Indigenous perspective. So as Joanna mentioned, I am the co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action and the founder of Sacred Earth Solar. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that we do, but first wanted to introduce myself and kind of give a basis of the perspective and the places and spaces that I come from and why I do the work that I do, because I'm, as I said, Laboucan Cree, and I was born into a small community that until my lifetime has been has also been impacted and affected by the tar sands and fracking and logging and all the different types of extractivism that we're also talking about today. So my dad is a residential day school survivor. He was hidden from in our community, was hidden from the Indian agents that were coming in and taking the children. And so that's my dad on the right corner. And then the left is my kukum, my grandmother. So I really love where we're from. But unfortunately, we are in the middle of the Alberta tar sands, as most people now know the tar sands. I was born in the Peace River region on the left side. And as you can see, pictures that we've taken, I spent over a decade working on tar sands issues, and I did the first part of my master's degree in environmental studies and researching tar sands extraction in around 2008 and 2009. The impacts are massive, as we know. I'm not going to go into them too much today, but just giving you a basis of why Canada is the highest per capita of GHG emissions in and around the world. For some reason, it's not letting me go now. It's interesting. Oh, here we go. So this is in the cultural context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the TRC and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but the context of cultural and environmental genocide and further encroachment, contamination, and destruction of territories resulting in loss of culture, traditions, and customs. Our way of life is being replaced by these types of landscapes, industrialized landscapes, drained and polluted watersheds, and contaminated air. That top part was taken from the Athabasca region. The bottom two photos are taken from where I'm from, with a pipeline being built by TransCanada, the North Central Corridor pipeline, and gas flaring in our homeland. I wanted to touch a little bit on the kind of bringing the faces of what sacrifice zones and sacrifice communities look like. Sometimes I don't think we see the externalized cost, and so that's why I do talk about that, because I grew up seeing it, and these are my cousin's kids who were exposed to the massive pipeline spill that I showed a picture of. If you go to oil on Laboucan land, you will see more around pipeline spills and why I've worked on that issue as well. And as you can see, it's a microcosm of the macrocosm of many Indigenous communities and BIPOC communities across Turtle Island, where we see cluster and cancer clusters and impact zones across to support this type of GHG, heavy intensive fossil fuel extraction. So that brings us to the question of, are we in an era of reconciliation? What does that mean with more than just words, and what does it mean in action? And in terms of this, with the careless economy that we are currently in, where, out of the country studies, we see that Canada is the worst per capita by record, that we are still living in an era of neocolonialism. We are in a crisis of, a state of crisis and economic hostages. I would like to also, and I think as we are coming into more conversations around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that colonialism has not ended, and that we are still living in a world that is out of balance from the destructive, careless economy that is based on patriarchal colonial values. And the form of neocolonialism I'm most familiar with is obviously resource extraction. But yeah, the TRC and kind of putting this into the conversation today. The TRC, as people may or may not know, was released in 2015. It detailed the inhumane treatment of Indigenous peoples from colonial government policy and church policy for over 100 years. Entire volume was dedicated to the unmarked graves. That is just now surfacing 6 years later, even though it has been detailed extensively in the TRC. And if also, I'd like to mention 94 recommendations of the TRC that really every person should read, especially if they make their homes in so-called Canada. Also, as I read through the TRC recommendations, I counted 22 different times that UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was named, as which Canada is a signatory. So, it's interesting that while we are saying that we're in an era of reconciliation, we still see this pursue an agenda of extractivism, and also the inability for Indigenous peoples in which the homelands where these externalized costs are taking place still have the inability to say no. As we see in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, where our rights are enshrined, we're still literally fighting in the courts to this day to ensure that that is the case, which was enshrined in 1981. So that's kind of couching us into this conversation of what a just recovery looks like as we transition to more equitable ways of living and being. As I said, there was in the Just Recovery over 100 plus signatories of the Just Recovery conversation, where Indigenous rights is upheld within the Just Recovery conversation that's been having since COVID began. And I also want to direct people to Section 32 if you don't know it already. The UNDRIP you can read online. It's really easily to access. So it also suggests for folks to read it if you are in this line of work. I think it's really important for people to read this international legislation, which does impact us here on the ground in so-called Canada, but Section 32, especially with free, prior, and informed consent, why you hear so many Indigenous peoples talk about this, because it is about the ability for our communities to say no, and that consent is different than, quote, consultation, which is a word that's thrown around a lot, which doesn't actually mean a lot in our communities. There is a critical paradigm shift also that needs to happen with kind of the conversations around what does collective care structures mean, how are we trying to switch from individualism into the collective as we face the climate crisis. Indigenous peoples have had an intimate and reciprocal relationship with Mother Earth, and so that's why you see so many Indigenous frontline land defenders out literally sacrificing their bodies, their times, their ability to spend time with their family, because we have that sacred responsibility to protect her as a basis of our cultural foundations of an Indigenous worldview, that all life is sacred. And so, we have had these governance structures that were really done away with colonial government policy and tearing at the social fabric through residential schools that are now, you see this era right now of revitalization in Indigenous communities, of our governance structures, of things that were literally illegal until the 1960s, that now we are starting to see more systems of care and collective healing accountability, which we had traditionally before colonization happened. So I'm going to talk a little bit about empowering community-based solutions in this context as well. One example is the project we did back home as a part of my master's degree. It was a 20.8 solar project which powers our health center. This is Carlton. He was 21 at the time. We were training him of how to install solar. It was the first time solar was actually in our community in the north of Alberta, in the heart of the tar sands. And you can see us doing a top-of-pole mount system, which is right in front of the school. You can see the school behind, where children go from kindergarten to grade 12. And it was a really joyous day because it was something that hadn't been seen or done at the time. This was in 2015 at the start of Sacred Earth Solar. We called the project Bitapan, which means coming of a dawn, coming of a new era. We had a ribbon cutting ceremony and a solar feast. and as well gave climate literacy workshops in communities because of the need for us, all our communities, not only Indigenous but non-Indigenous communities, to be climate literate, and why we are really facing climate change at this time, because we don't have literacy within our communities. It's not taught in our schools, and that is, I think, a big reason why we are really facing catastrophic climate change. I also wanted to touch on quickly around returning to zero waste communities, which our communities have always been zero waste, net zero communities, Indigenous peoples have. But unfortunately, there is a co-optation of this word. And I would definitely, if people haven't already, even though I'm sure it went around a lot, it did this article, which was really great, from the perspective of climate scientists, saying the concept of net zero is a dangerous trap. So I'd Google that if you haven't read it already. But current net zero policies will not keep warming within the 1.5 that we're talking about today, because they were never intended to. They were and still are driving, to protect business as usual, not to protect the climate. And so there is a concern in the scientific community around the Paris Agreement, BECCFs, offsetting, geoengineering, and net zero. So I think this is a really great discussion as well that we don't have time right now to talk about, but I would definitely direct people to read that, because I was happy to see that discussion, because many Indigenous peoples actually have that critique in as well, that, when capitalism and market-based mechanisms have created the problem, so why are we using them to create the solution? We know that that's not going to be the case, that a lot of the things that are being promoted are in fact unproven technologies and extremely expensive, and that's why they haven't been able to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But instead, we need to see things like this, where we see communities transitioning away from fossil fuel extraction and implementing renewable energy technologies as a transition technology. One thing that I wanted to point folks to that is a really good resource out there, if you haven't seen it already, it's called Power to the People. We spent 3 years going from coast to coast to coast to 26 locations across the country, profiling communities that have in fact done this implementation, not just talked about the implementation, but actually implemented these projects. So from all the types of transition technologies that you can think of, as well as food security and eco-housing. So you can check out Power to the People. You can go to the website, powertothepeople.tv, and you can see all these different types of projects and an amazing climate leadership that Indigenous communities are doing across the board. So back to the question of the era of reconciliation. So I wanted to close around not only, this of the TRC, and that we need more than just words, more than just one day. How do we make this go into something that is from self-care, from individualized to collective care, and how do we, what we like to call healing justice, and ensuring that communities are able to thrive instead of just survive. And one of the reasons why, what we've seen repeatedly, unfortunately, and speaking to the philanthropic sector, I'm sure that you come across this a lot, but I think it's something that we have not addressed as a movement, especially in the era of climate change, where we see serious burnout across the board for activists, where we see the psychological, emotional, and physical well-being paired with hopelessness, and really, in fact, causing people to either permanently leave the movement spaces, permanently leave this work because it's not sustainable, and/or, unfortunately, in the case of some of my friends, have committed suicide because they have committed their lives to this work, and yet we see the sacrifice of the individual for the collective, but when the individual needs support from the collective, we don't see that happening. And so we kind of are at this precipice where we see just burnout happening so much, and we have this narrative currently right now where we think, it's the impetus is put on, oh, well, we have the younger generation, and it's the same thing of, using them as another extractive way of saying we're just going to extract again from these young people, and then they burn out and we're going to throw them away, because that's what we see repeatedly happening since the 60s, where people burn out and they leave, and it's a throwaway culture based on, the hyperproductivity of capitalism and the ability to throw things away like people. So I just wanted to mention that as well. And that burnout is even more prevalent among marginalized activists and people of color. because they're dealing with everyday acts of racism and microaggressions and oppression. So how do we support that? So Healing Justice, just so folks know, is a framework that recognizes the impact of trauma to individuals, trauma and violence onto individuals and communities, and names collective processes that helps transform these resources. So in a system and society that actively targets Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples with bodies with violence, oppression, and terror, it is critical to build movements that fight and achieve justice for all. So this includes well-being, healing, and not only surviving, but thriving. So thinking of it as resiliency and healing as strategic in this work, and that people have access to healing spaces and places. And this idea that self-care, self-care is only accessible if you can afford it a lot of the times, but we need to come to a place where self-care and healing is not a luxury, that is a priority and necessity in the work that we do, and it's also prioritized within our movement spaces and prioritized within the funding, ensuring that, that it's not seen as a self-indulgent thing, but it's actually seen as resiliency and thriving in our movements. Wanted to finish with this quote here, and this is, if you haven't read this book, I would definitely recommend it as well. I'm on the board with Edgar for Andean Collective, and he talks about, all my relations, a world in which everything and it's an Indigenous value, and this idea of all my relations, which we say many times in our ceremonies, a world in which everyone and everything is interconnected and interdependent. So Edgar says, all my relations mean that everyone is at home here. Everyone has a responsibility in making things right. Everyone has a role in the process of healing, regardless of whether they caused or received more harm. All of our suffering is mutual. All of our healing is mutual. All of our thriving is mutual. So I wanted to end with that. And thank you so much for listening, and look forward to the conversation. Hi.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, absolutely brilliant, Melina. And I think you can see how Melina is able to put, from absolutely kind of all of these macro systems together, and how, these sacrificed communities and individuals, and how these cultures of extraction are endemic. But they weren't necessarily always there. They are things that we can change. Patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism have come along, and the ways that Indigenous leadership is disrupting the narrative and demonstrating the power of healing justice and land back, and what real truth and reconciliation looks like. It's fundamental. It's central to this conversation, and the role of philanthropy as well. So thanks so much, Melina. I now hand the screen over to Vanessa Timmer, whom I had the pleasure of meeting a year and a bit ago, but it feels like we've become fast friends. We actually haven't met face to face, just through screens. And Vanessa and I decided that we were going to partner to do this work together, really try to think about what should philanthropy be doing differently, and what could all of her global and local research, how could that be really accelerated to shift cultures and behavior. And, bringing in folks like Lewis and Devika and Melina, there's so many incredible individuals that are doing this work. So how can we build off of one another? So Vanessa has been doing research and connected to communities for years and years. She's had a TV show. She's the executive director of OneEarth. But she really is a global leader, and it's my pleasure to welcome her and to share her perspective for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll truly open it up for conversation. Over to you, Vanessa.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, it's great to co-host this with MakeWay. I'm from the executive director of OneEarth. We're a nonprofit think and do tank. So we both do the research and also the action on the ground and globally on sustainable ways of living. And I'm here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations peoples, also known as, now known as Vancouver, but that's the Coast Salish people's land. And I'm pleased to speak and connect with all of you about kind of recommendations for action. And of course, all of the previous speakers have already spoken about their thoughts around action. And all of you on, all 143 of you on the phone, or however many are, 46 now, we're all doing many things to move the dial on climate and nature and justice. And, you know, the work that we're talking about today is really a complement to many of the things you've already been doing on supply side solutions, policy. And what we're saying is that the actions we want to take, it's really an untapped potential, this lifestyle behavior lens, particularly because 72% of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to households, but also these lifestyle changes enable better and maybe ease off on some of the need for supply side solutions such as CO2 removal technologies. And so that's really why we wanted to really look at this, is to connect it to some of the excellent work you've done in the past. And as Joanna is saying, to come together as a collaborative group to take on the lifestyles and behavior change to the scale and magnitude that Devika, Lewis, and Melina have been speaking to. So with this vast untapped potential, the one thing I can say is typically we have not done well on talking about this topic. We've actually blamed people. We've used fear and guilt messaging. It's not been very effective. And one of the best expressions of that came to me on a call about a year ago now at the launch of the Future Ground Network. This is Rebecca Hamilton and Sam Lin, who are part of a fantastic group here in the Coast Salish Nation called Sustainabiliteens. And they spoke about their experience of getting involved in this work. And they really spoke to my heart, because when I was 14 years old, my sister Dagmar and myself and 14 others started the Environmental Youth Alliance. So I can definitely relate to taking action as a young person. This is me marching in the old streets of Vancouver. And so what Rebecca said, which I thought was really evocative, is she said, you know, I remember being in elementary school and sitting on the dusty class carpet and learning about this thing called climate change and the resulting impacts for hurting millions of people around the world. And then I remember being told that this unprecedented catastrophe was in fact my fault, and that the only way to solve it was for me to personally change my light bulbs, take shorter showers, not litter, and drive less. And she goes on to say, this individualized action, it's disempowering, it's a limiting framework because our choices are constrained by bigger systems, but it's also not smart because social movements and organizing for collective action and climate justice movements, that's the force that's big enough to shift the overall balance of power. And she also went on to say is also where she made some of her best friends, was in that community. And so I think that's another piece of the puzzle, connecting with others, collaborating together. So the limits of that individualizing framework, that's the first pitfall that often we fall into. But Sam Lin makes the other point, which is that she said, my understanding was that solutions to climate change required us to recycle. I would tell my parents to stop idling the car. I would turn off my lights and try to take shorter showers. At the same time, I was equally passionate about social justice and building a world where we all had opportunities to thrive. In the beginning, these two narratives were distinct and separate in my mind, but it's about bridging our understanding of climate change and social justice in order to get to the roots of the climate crisis and rebuild our world with equity and justice. So we really want to be focusing not on individualized action and also across ecological limits, living within planetary boundaries, justice and fairness, and being guided by well-being rather than gross domestic product, as we mentioned at the beginning. So as Lewis was mentioning, we want to reduce harmful and excessive consumption and inequity and increase in sustainable consumption, basic needs for all, and well-being. How do we do that? Well, the first thing is about what we measure, which is we want to measure whether we're staying within boundaries in our carbon budget and ecological budgets fairly and increasing well-being. And we also want to measure it across these domains. But here's the thing, what we measure isn't necessarily where we put our action. So if we want changes happening in transport, goods, housing, and food, we might not just focus just on that. We might need to look broader for bigger actions that we can take. And I'll show you what I mean. So let's move away from some of these pitfalls of overly focusing on individual action or just on environment and justice separately, or just on these domains, and go for some strategic shifts. These strategic shifts I'm about to show you to inform our action were developed also with the Hot or Cool Institute, with climate outreach funded generously by the KR Foundation, and with Erica Prigan-Wright. And I also want to note that SCORI, the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative, Helena Brown and Philip Verhofter on the call, and Jeffrey Barber and Karen Ontank as well. And they've really helped us think about this from their research and expertise. So here they are, the 5 strategic shifts. We need to move from that individualized action to taking action on collective ways and with societal change in mind. From static snapshots of lives at one point, what is a footprint at this moment, to thinking about lives in their full dynamics. From just focusing on consumption to broadening our view to better living, to thinking that there's one size fits all sustainable lifestyle, to looking at the diverse lifestyles and livelihoods, the way we show up in our work and livelihoods around the world. And from just speaking about limits to also thinking about regeneration. So I'm going to spend a little more time on the first one and then briefly on the other ones, because this will help us orient the types of actions we want to take. So the first one is, the great news is that individual actions do add up. So we do want to ensure that people are given the kind of guide to take higher impact actions. Many people still think recycling is the biggest action they can take, rather than some of these bigger things like dietary choice or how we transport ourselves or house ourselves, or how big our housing is. We also want to take a whole life approach, because, for example, if we save money in our heating of our house or by buying plant-based diets, if we then use that money to drive more, then we get those rebound effects. So let's take whole life perspectives and build capacity, as Lewis said. And this is one thing that I want to say, there's some really unexpected solutions when we don't just focus on domains. For example, we found that shortened work weeks actually lead to reduced emissions. The patterns of time use, including how busy we are, we actually consume more when we're really busy and stressed. So how we balance work life and leisure is critical. There's a lot of gendered aspects to this discussion as to who makes decisions. We can also see a lot of opportunity in shifting ownership models. Rosemary Cooper is on the call from the Share, Reuse, Repair initiative, and that does a great job of looking at ownership being spread across a larger group, things held in commons like tool libraries or sharing of spaces, much more cooperative ownership models. And while we do all this discussion about individualized action, we have to remember that a lot of the way we live our lives are because of our habits. And a lot of choices we make are driven not by rational choice, but by emotions. So, and we are actually, for example, taking a shower every day is a cultural practice that I might do because it arises from our culture. So it isn't a practice that we consciously think about. It is kind of embedded in our culture. So let's embrace the irrational, automatic routine aspects of behavior and use different behavior approaches like prompts, giving recognition to people, influencing each other socially, making certain programs a default. This is the kind of actions we want to take. And we want to engage people in groups because we actually take these actions in a space of interconnection with others. So Lewis showed you that embedded person. So I'm going to show you that same idea, but in terms of why we consume all the way to the left because we want to meet needs and desires. So people take actions in their lives because of habits or choice or social practices. But we also consume because we want to fulfill social connections and functions like belonging, connecting with others, being recognized, fitting in. And in reverse, our way of living actually influences others. If we put solar panels on our house, Other people might get inspired to do the same. If we, for example, eat differently than we would have, other people feel the same. So this is about talking together about the actions we're taking to spread those social norms, to normalize sustainable living. And by the way, when we talk to other people, we should recognize that there are different motivations that lead people to sustainable living practices. And we just did a study on that here in British Columbia that we'll put in the chat for you to take a look at. Lewis talked about how we're locked in and enabled or constrained by different structures that make it more affordable or accessible, convenient, or desirable, and then within the Earth system. So in terms of, you'll see it here, I love this slide from the Citra, one of our partners in Finland, who shows Tanya at the top, reducing her per capita carbon footprint by taking these different actions, including it with others, like with her neighbors. But she's supported to do so by company and market solutions, by government and policy solutions. But it doesn't just go one way. People influence the system too. We're part of the system. So we do our actions, but we also can shape narratives, social norms, normalize behaviors. In terms of governments, we can vote, volunteer, advocate, and create these mobilizations, these groundswells of support for bold action across government institutions. And we ourselves are also often producers. Perhaps we connect with others and make things. It's our livelihoods, not just our lifestyles we're interested in here. We shape supply side markets and technologies also by giving them social license or backlash if we think it's greenwashing. And we use our money to influence the system too. So as climate outreach says, to be on track, everybody needs to take action. Governments, businesses, individuals, particularly the biggest footprints. When social norms start to shift, low carbon lifestyles become desirable and mainstream. Infrastructure shifts to lock in positive change. Governments heighten their ambition and commitment to ensure we reduce emissions. As the social mandate gets stronger, the emission gap gets smaller, and our chances of getting to a better world increase. Lifestyle change makes systems change possible. So let's take a look at some of the other big moves, strategic moves we need to do. This one's really interesting. Typically, we've looked at lifestyle carbon footprints as snapshots. What is somebody's lifestyle footprint right now? But we can actually take advantage of life changes and transitions, such as becoming a parent, retiring, immigrating, moving homes, because this is the moment when habits are in flux. And if we build support, we can actually get people to move into very sustainable lives at that moment and support them on a journey. We also need to broaden our view from consumption to better living, because our lives are not just about consumption. Happiness is connected to trust, health, safety, a sense of purpose, time spent with others, in nature, in spiritual practice, and in community. So let's not just talk about what we're reducing for high intensive groups, but also what we're gaining in terms of non-material, non-market aspects of well-being. And that's where that healing justice and support for self-care is critical. Lewis mentioned imagining sustainable living, using artists to do so, and creating experiments of the future. And Joanna also mentioned supporting those living sustainable lives today. As Melina was saying, Indigenous communities are leading the charge, women, youth, intentional communities such as eco-villages, they can help us shape our cultural foundations. So we look from consumption to our lives in all their glory. And that's what'll help us move the dial in such a massive way. And we want to kind of visualize what life could be like in these sustainable living futures in ways that have a rich rootedness in place. This is from a vision from South Africa. And I love this quote from Silawat Cloutier, who said, she's from a Canadian Inuit activist, you know, we need to reimagine new ways of doing things, our unsustainable economic values, and align them with Indigenous values. Inuit and other Indigenous peoples are not just victims of globalization wreaking havoc on our communities. With their understanding of nature, which they depend on for their food source and powerful character builder for children, Indigenous peoples have much to offer in helping to galvanize a largely disconnected urban world. She strongly believes Indigenous wisdom is the medicine we seek in healing our planet and creating a sustainable world. And this is kind of getting back to, and there's a sacred or a solar example. It's not going to be one size fits all lifestyles. Let's celebrate the diversity. And that means we need to shrink and share as well. The strategies for addressing that 10% and 1% income earners, there's many suggestions. For example, engaging those of us with high incomes in our multiple roles as consumers, as lobbyists, as investors, as symbols, redefining wealth, and not just talking about reducing footprints, but reparations and reconciliation. For the middle income group, it's leapfrogging. And we have to remember that while we're living high intense lifestyles, other people are living half lives. Our lifestyles are dependent on others inequitably serving us around the world. And we need to acknowledge the contribution of resource poor communities, ensure their basic needs are met. And of course, building Indigenous and leading communities and their strength. And finally, moving from limits to regeneration. How do we heal as we start building these social and ecological futures? Because we have to take the reality check. We are in ecological overshoot right now, and we have systematically oppressed many communities in extractive ways. And so as we move forward, it is about regenerating with leadership from those leading communities. So those are the strategic shifts. And I'll just say that in the funder collaborative that Joanna will speak to, we're actually recommending these funder priorities: reinforcing our ecological interdependence and nature regeneration, supporting these leading communities and Indigenous-led movements, transforming our culture, focusing on those emission hotspots, but in ways that move across domain, whole lives, and income groups, and really emphasizing the role that cities play in actually shaping our lives. We've got the BCIT Center for Eco-Cities here on the call, Christina Olson and Cora Halsworth and Jenny Moore, and there's a lot we can do in actually getting cities to take a big step in the right direction. And ultimately, this all helps us ask, how do we want to live as we move forward? So I look forward to collaborating with many of you on this work and to building this leadership together here in Canada.
Amazing. Thanks, Vanessa. I don't know how you did that all in 15 minutes. A beautiful presentation and super inspiring. This is now an opportunity if folks want to put a question in the chat, if they want to comment on something. There's a lot of, okay, Helena, over to you and just introduce yourself.
Wow, that was quick. I didn't realize that the moment I pressed raise hand, there I am.
Power of technology.
I'm Helena Brown. I am on the faculty of Clark University in the US, in Massachusetts, and I am a co-founder of Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative, SCORI. I want to thank all of you, the speakers. It was a powerful set of presentations and angles. But I would also like us to think, to move somewhat from the conceptual to more concrete type of conversation. It's not enough for us to be inspired. We also need to understand the tools that are out there at disposal. So I find the report, 1.5 Degree Lifestyle, excellent report. And also it is a confrontational report, because what it does, it puts it out there, right? In numbers, what has to change in a very specific way. And Canada, of course, is this poster child of huge per capita consumption, and you actually put it in numbers, right? We have to ask Canadians to live in spaces that are approximately half of what they are right now, right? And so on. So what that means when you think about it is confronting the very heart of, I think, of the identity of Canadians, right? I think of Canada as this, still having some of this frontier mentality, big country, lots of land, and of course, very big houses. When you have lots of land and very big houses, forget public transit. It will never be possible economically, right? And so on, right? So we really need to start thinking about, okay, when we talk, that we will need to ask cultures to really make a huge leap of saying we Canadians are maybe not anymore in the world of limited resources, right? The frontier where everybody has this huge space. How are you going to do it? Let's talk about specifics. So what I think is that the 1.5 report needs a follow-up report that actually confronts this issue at a much more specific level. And to do that, the culture doesn't change just because we present people with a vision. The culture change because government comes up with policies and people see alternatives emerging and they begin to think, I could live that way, right? So we really need
Melina. Yeah, thanks, Melina. Thank you so much. It's a really, really good point. And I think there were, particularly in Melina and Vanessa's comments, some very practical things that we are seeing in terms of how those of us who live in this country are trying to shift the culture. But it's good to be woken up by a report like Lewis's to just show how far Canadians have to go. So just maybe to any of the three speakers, very concrete things that you see are happening, tools that are already being applied, that are shifting our cultures, things that you know that are already happening that we need to accelerate. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I could speak to that, Joanna. Thank you, Helena, for that. Absolutely. I think so. A few things that we've been working with OneEarth is first of all, where are the transformations and changes already taking place? Because there's many individuals, communities that are already, the trends are already shifting. Everything from the way people want to live their lives that are not necessarily following the hyper-consumption lifestyle, all the way to coming together as communities, as Melina was reflecting, to solve this challenge. So that's one of the things that I think is really critical, is finding those trends on the move. And so there's many examples, but I'll give one that is one that we're involved with, is that we're Cora Halsworth and Dr. Timmer, who are on the phone today, are working in Saanich on Vancouver Island in a project called One Planet Saanich. And what's really interesting about it is it was part of a One Planet Living, One Planet Cities initiative by a regional in the United Kingdom. And what it does in the One Planet Saanich program is that it brings together the entire community around this goal of One Planet Living. So the mayor is involved, the councillors are involved, and so is the local farmers market, the schools, the businesses, the local citizens. And so together they're kind of solving this challenge, and they're backed by the data from the BCIT Center for Ecocities. So Ryan and Cora are on the call. They are basically giving them the detailed data, and it's also informed what is important to that local community. They keep an eye, they're focused on doing this with justice and equity and really building well-being. They've had competitions to imagine, different solutions. They engage people across these different sectors. So I just wanted to note that as one example where I think one of the best things you can do concretely is bring together that kind of ecosystem of actors with that vision, with the numbers, in a way that stimulates action from different parties. So that's one example that's very concrete.
Thanks, Melina. Did you want to jump in there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I will go back to Power to the People. That was, a 3-year project where we went from coast to coast and we show the actual implementation of projects and how the engagement of multi-sector projects come together through government participation, through the renewable energy sector, through building renewable energy policy, through pushing those types of needs so I guess I'm going to put this here again. This is the Inspired Initiatives page of Power to the People, where it shows different places across the country that have actually implemented, from my community to Kanaka Bar to Alert Bay to Haida Gwaii to Listigosh in Quebec to Sea Sheldon, BC, to the Teslin community in the Yukon, to the Six Rivers of the Grand Nation in Ontario, Bella Coola, Taloquit, to Taiku River Tlingit, which is the Yukon-BC border, Ukulani, Gull Bay in Ontario. So there is just so many projects that are happening. There's literally hundreds into the thousands of projects that are happening. So I think it's important for us to actually, instead of recreating the wheel and thinking that these aren't happening, that they are happening, and that we need to learn from the communities that are actually doing it, and also learn what the critiques and kind of analysis are from these communities after they have engaged with big developers, renewable energy togethers. They have engaged with government, both federally and provincially and municipally. So I think it's this is happening, and I think there's a lot more that we can kind of learn from these communities that are actually doing this. And even with my community, when we put up our project, there was not renewable energy government policy, but after the Notley government came in, they actually were kind of from projects like ours, where we didn't have government funding, we didn't have renewable energy policy, robust renewable energy policy, that started to become implemented within that. I mean, that's done away with the Kenney government, but it just shows that when these projects go up, when they're being implemented, that puts pressure on all of the systems, because it shows that governments aren't doing enough, right? Which we know. So it allows us to push for a more robust renewable energy policy, but also say that sometimes renewable energy policy or climate policy isn't enough, because it's also done in a vacuum where it's not including Indigenous perspectives. So I'll also say there is a report that we just put out through Indigenous Climate Action that's called Decolonizing Climate Policy, and I'll put the link up there as well.
Yeah, just to underline to Helena, what's happening in this country around truth and reconciliation is the acknowledgement that Indigenous governance and Indigenous sovereignty, if Indigenous peoples actually have sovereign control over their lands and territories and waters, that they will be stewarded in a way, and that there will be a very systemic shift. And so that, it's what's referred to often as a land back movement as well. So kind of the shift in resources that's a very, very topical conversation that's happening here within this country, not without its significant heat, but it's something that certainly our organization is very connected to. Lewis, anything else that you wanted to add in terms of kind of the practical things that you're seeing?
I think Helena's question is really very, very important. When you see those numbers, they're daunting numbers. How do you translate this into concrete action? And a conversation like this is just the beginning. I think one of the most radical things you can do now is just to be honest. Just to be very honest about the situation, honest when you vote, honest when you talk about your freedom to consume. If we have a limited budget shared equitably and you consume beyond your budget, who picks up the tab? That's someone else, somewhere else. Yeah. When you vote for someone who is putting out policies that clearly disadvantage other people or other groups, are you being honest to yourself and to the things that you actually see? One of the most radical things you can do now in an emergency like this is to be honest. Some of the things we have in the report that I'd like to bring out, which are very practical. Two of them, one, universal basic services, and two, choice editing. I'll start with choice editing because it's one of those uncomfortable areas. Governments or businesses choice edit by saying, for public health reasons, well, we don't give you the option of not using a seatbelt if you're driving, or at least in Canada, not buying a gun and running around with it in public and things like this. This is called choice editing. But in a planetary or in a climate emergency, shouldn't sustainability be a criteria for choice editing? Shouldn't we be able to say private jets are not allowed because we simply do not have the budget for it? We don't have the carbon budget to be able to afford this. Should we continue building highways instead of beginning to build public transportation systems? Should we still be licensing houses that allow for, 300 square meters per family when we know that we cannot afford this? So how do we start choice editing? How do we take out the harmful consumption options from even being there in the first place? And how do we induce a social innovation that leads to acceptance of social radical measures, but also that allows a certain innovation that brings in alternative ways of meeting needs? We know that there are several communities around the world that are living well within planetary limits. They're happy, they have well-being. What can we learn from them? How can we translate those into how we design our own policies and practices and everyday living, or how we relate to each other? The second one, which I've briefly touched upon, is universal basic services. I know that a big part of the conversation now is around universal basic income, but it's a bit, there's only so much you can do with money, and money just adds a lot more consumption into the economy. We have to find non-economic approaches to dealing with this. If we keep using just economic approaches to dealing with this problem, we're just gonna tunnel dig and lock ourselves in even more. In the report, we have something called universal basic services. The whole idea is profits and so on come from the global commons, even if businesses would not acknowledge this. Everyone, therefore, deserves to get a very basic minimum of their needs covered through this exploitation. So healthcare, which Canada knows very well, education, digital services, and food, basic amounts of food. These are things that should be covered across the board. The logic to this is it's both a moral one, but it goes beyond that. There's a lot of research. You look at research by Julia Steinberger and her team, that where she used to be at least, showing that shared approaches are not only less carbon intensive per person, they actually start building communities and bringing people together. So a lot more shared such as tools, libraries, more communal housing or reduction of housing sizes and more collaborative sort of housing can help not just in reducing the per capita impact of persons in Canada and around the world actually, but it would help in what we're seeing now, a lot of frustration of individualization, people living alone, and the psychological stress that goes with it. Just being very honest about these things, including saying, I don't know, can create a lot of room for us to find a better, to build a better home for ourselves.
Yeah, thanks. We've quickly run out of time, but I didn't want anybody to feel like the comments that are being shared are not being taken on board. Yes, this recording is going to be made available, and I'm assuming that people's PowerPoint presentations are also shareable. I'm working on that assumption. But just wanted to say that MakeWay and OneEarth are very committed to a funder collaborative of really figuring out the ways in which we can drive this system-led change within Canada, building upon some of this global research and also support to leading communities, the ways in which there should be far more research into social science and behavior change that around climate and nature that hasn't existed. And so next month, for any funding institution that's on this call, you are most welcome to really help us put far more money into the system to be shifting and supporting communities and movements and organizations that are trying to drive this work, not as individuals, but as collectives, because that is what we know is ultimately going to work. And how individual change shifts political and corporate behavior and vice versa, and how to get that moving, because we know in so many parts of the world that that shift is happening much more visibly and much more quickly. And it's something that we want to really inspire and generate in Canada. And we're hoping that there's a philanthropic community in Canada. There's a handful of funders who've come forward and say, yes, sign me up. I really am very interested. And they can be outside, obviously, of the environmental funding community. It's the funders that are supporting the arts, that are supporting Indigenous rights, that are supporting health, that are outside of these domains, but that are understanding the fundamental cultural behavioral shift that every single person living in this country has to make, but one that we hope that we can make joyfully, where our communities are going to be healthier, where there is going to be healing justice, where there is going to be less loneliness, where there is going to be healthier foods and shorter distances in which to travel. And so this is the work that we are committed to doing. And as I said at the beginning, this was just one of many conversations to have, but one that we want to really lift up. That so much of the conversation in our country around climate has been kind of a battle of kind of the future of energy, and where, what's the future of the tar sands, the oil sands. But as we know, it's so much more than this. And seeing some of the comments about, kids are being told, they're reusable bottles and the recycling and, the little things that kids are guilting into their parents. We hope we have demonstrated here that's not what we're talking about. It's being able to support the social platforms, the social infrastructure, the kind of shifts into social movements that's going to shift corporate and corporate behavior and policy change. Really, really take on the system collectively. So do reach out to joanna.kerr@makeway.org if you're interested in joining the collaborative. But before I end, is there any last word that my wonderful colleagues want to share? Lewis, I'll start with you and I'll end with Vanessa. Any final words before we wrap up?
Thank you so much, Joanna. I think I'm really one of the very lucky persons that has lived in Canada, and I've enjoyed being there. The huge thing to me that is very personal is that Canadian culture is a very, very supportive culture. It is a culture of people, right? So it feels a bit unfortunate that it has to rank so high up there, much against what people actually think is happening. They hope, however, part of the intention, and obviously because Canada was one of the leading economies, part of the intention was really hoping that a conversation like this would start in a country that, from every indication, has the value orientation and has sort of the global power and has a sort of a capital, a reputational capital globally, to push other countries, to push its citizens and other countries, that we start seeing change beyond just wording and accounting gymnastics. I feel extremely privileged that I've been invited to talk here. And I hope that it's not seen as a blame on Canada, but it's just opening a window so you can look outside and see what is happening on the streets there and take it into consideration. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lewis. Melina, any final words from you?
Just also the flip of the script of even though Canada is an incredibly privileged place to be, you know, coming from an Indigenous community where I grew up with no running water and no paved roads, you know, there's that dichotomy that exists even here within Canada, where the communities with the most burden of environmental degradation and climate change impacts are shouldering that, but yet have the least amount of access to resources, and a lot of times are doing the most, in my opinion, putting themselves on the front lines to abate climate change. And so I'd say just continue to support Indigenous communities. And I really like the quote where it says, move money where the trauma is the deepest, in terms of the healing justice and the work that, you know, needs to be done through this process of truth and reconciliation, which I think every single person that calls their home Turtle Island needs to be a part of that initial step in a long journey of what actually reconciliation should and could look like.
Thank you for that. Vanessa, the last word with you.
Yeah, I just want to say that this is kind of uncharted territory for all of us, and we want to draw, as Lena is saying, on long wisdom from the past and look towards crafting a future together. And it's going to be not easy, but we've also done big things together in the past. And so I just look forward to joining forces with all of you who are ready to make that move. I put my email in the chat, reach out to me. The Funder Collaborative is one part, and let's join forces with many of the work that all of you are doing in this area. And I look forward to that.
Thanks, everybody, and have a beautiful day.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.